Welcome, Yetaboon, to Season 1, Episode 3 of the Gifted Present Podcast with your host, Jess, your upcoming lifestyle blogger, website coming soon, so stay tuned, and myself, Sehlynn, your internet friend and best hype girl. So May is actually Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Woohoo!
Woo!
Hey, 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 to all my fellow Asians out there. We have a 4-part series on AAPI topics that we will be covering for this month, so stay tuned. We're going to be covering topics like history, immigrant families, and racism, and also share our personal experiences. So, Jess, what are we unpacking today?
Oh, I am so excited for this episode and also for this month because y'all got to recognize Asians are amazing. Asian American history is very important. And so that is exactly what we are going to be unpacking today is Asian American history. Now, before you skip to the next podcast on your list, hear me out on this. This is not going to be a snooze fest of a history lesson. I promise you that. It's just that we both believe that it's so important to understand our history and our roots. And if you're a second generation Asian American, like Sehlynn and I are, you might be thinking that we don't have roots here that run deeper than our parents who immigrated here. And yeah, I guess in a world that cared more about specificity, we wouldn't have this issue. But for a country that values individuality as much as America does, it is ironic that with such diverse groups of people and cultures, we could be lumped into one category, which is Asians. And we even have rivalries and bad blood amongst ourselves. There's the classic tension between Japan and Korea and then Pakistan and India. So yes, it is unfair and fairly inaccurate to lump us all into one category. However, the reality is that we live in an America that is either ignorant of our differences or doesn't bother to care. So whether we like it or not, we are all linked to each other and our lives become interconnected, even if we want nothing to do with each other. So with that being said, Asians have been making voyages to the Americas as early as the 1500s, and what happened to those early Asians does have a trickle effect on us, the Asian Americans and the Asians who live in the US today. So before we dive in, I'm going to be drawing a lot of references from a book by a historian named Erica Lee, and she wrote a book titled The Making of Asian America. So if you've yet to read it, you definitely have to add this book to your bucket list of books to read, especially if you're an Asian American, because it gives such a great and compelling summary of Asian American history, and I highly, highly, highly recommend it. So yeah, let's jump right into this. Sehlynn, I want to first start with reading you some quotes that I've gathered from some Asian Americans. So here's the first one. I feel that I am more American than Chinese. I am an American citizen by birth, having the title for all rights, but they treat me as if I was a foreigner. Second quote is, I thought I was American, but America would not have me. In many respects, she would not recognize me as American. Moreover, I feel racial prejudice against us everywhere. We are American citizens in name, but not in fact. So I wanted to ask you, before we dive in deeper, just how do these quotes make you feel? Can you relate to them at all? What are your thoughts?
Oh, I can relate to all of it. And it's not even about, it resonates something in me. I know I can relate to it because that's exactly how I feel. And it takes me back to a time of memory that I have of a discussion I had with my mom. I don't even remember what we were talking about, to be quite honest. But I just remember me saying, I'm Korean. And she said, no, you're an American. And to me, it was just so hard for me to comprehend that because when I grew up, I was just told I'm Korean, and I was proud to be Korean because my mom was, she would remind me of how awesome Korea is because we're so small, but we're still alive. We've made it this far. We're great people. So I always had this idea and this notion and belief and that we're awesome and we're Korean and to be proud of who I am and to be proud of my descent. But it was just that moment where my mom was, no, you're not Korean, you're American. It really, really rocked my boat because I couldn't understand why she saw me that way. And it wasn't until I'm an adult that I understand now, it's because culturally I am more American to her because I'm not fully Korean.
Oh, yeah, that totally hits the feels because I think a lot of second gen Asian Americans can feel that, where their parents are from a different country and there's always that battle between East versus West in the household. So I just wanted to let you know that these quotes, as relatable as they are, they weren't said by people of today or even a couple years ago. They actually predate World War II, and they were recorded between the late 1800s to the early 1900s, which makes sense because, as many may know, the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. However, as horribly racist as this act was, when you look at the grand scheme of American and global history, it's actually only a mere symptom of a deeper underlying issue. Seeds were sown centuries before, and we have to go back to ancient history if we were even to try to tackle and identify where racism first started. So in order to avoid a total snooze fest, we don't have time to discuss ancient history in this episode, so I'm just going to fast forward to when the Europeans discovered the Americas. With the discovery of the Americas, the first migrations of Asians to the Americas happened around 1565, and it was numbered to be about 40,000 to 100,000 Asians from China, Japan, the Philippines, and South and Southeast Asia. They arrived in Acapulco, which is present-day Mexico, on Spanish ships called Manila galleons. These people came as sailors, servants, or slaves, and by the 1600s, the majority of sailors recruited on these Manila galleons were either Filipino or Chinese. Now, conditions on these Manila galleons were absolutely awful. The provisions that were brought on board were usually infested with maggots, and both rats and disease ran rampant on these ships. And because most of the space on these ships were devoted to cargo, many of the sailors had to sleep on deck, and so it was very common for 3 to 4 men to be found dead each morning from the cold. On top of that, the Asian sailors received half the rations of a Spanish crew member would receive, and to prevent desertion, ship captains would only pay for a part of the wages for the first voyage and would promise to pay the rest after they completed the return trip. It was reported that these Asian sailors were treated like dogs, so you can only imagine how the slaves who were boarded on these ships were treated. There are reports of some women who were actually captured for sale in the concubine market or as sex slaves, and Spanish officials and nobles were known to bring Filipino women on board as their concubines, and then they would abandon them once they reached Acapulco, and a lot of times these women would be pregnant at that time. So Spain was the first to connect Asia and the Americas together, but other empires slowly began to colonize as well. And then this whole thing with, you might have heard of it, England and the US happened. We are all very familiar with that part of history. But even in their feud, Asia was still connected. Like, for example, the Boston Tea Party, that was 342 chests of Chinese Darjeeling tea that was dumped into the Boston Harbor, and the Asian in me is just writhing because I'm like, even then, Americans were so wasteful.
I love that you say wasteful right away because that's immediately what I thought. I was like, what waste? All that tea. Do you know what we could have done with that?
I know, all that tea, all of that delicious tea meant to be turned into milk tea and boba.
Even the way that you said, yeah. Even the way that you said the tea's name, I was like, say it again. It sounds so good.
Yeah, I know, Darjeeling. So anyway, after the U.S. gained its independence from England, it wasted absolutely no time with trading with the Asians, and they sailed to China in 1783. So as trade increased, naturally more Asians started to migrate to the U.S. The first documented Chinese woman arriving in the U.S. was in 1834. Her name was Afeng Moy, and she was only 19 years old. She was brought as a sales ploy to encourage people to buy imported Chinese goods, and she had bound feet, and she was dressed up in gaudy Chinese traditional clothing, and she was put in an exhibit with a bunch of paper lanterns and silk for people to gawk at. She had to walk around in her exhibit, and this encouraged people to view Chinese and Asians as exotic and as other. And with her bound feet, she was also seen as weird, disfigured, and inferior. And soon after, she was picked up by P.T. Barnum, who eventually cast her aside when he found another Chinese belle, and no one actually knows what happened to Afeng Moy after that. So I just wanted to pause here because I just laid out some really heavy stuff talking about slavery and exploitation. So Sehlynn, with what I've shared so far, what are some themes that you found from this part of history that you can still see today in our country?
I think a common theme I see is trade. I think people couldn't get enough of Asia before, and they still can't get enough of Asia now.
Oh, girl.
I mean, the Korean skincare trade right now is going nuts, you know, and before, like, it wasn't even introduced until, like, I don't know how many years ago, it's getting close to 10 now, but it's not even a decade old.
Yeah.
It hasn't even been a decade, you know.
I didn't even think of that. Yeah.
But it's been around in our culture forever. Like,
yeah.
The whole 10-step skincare, taking care of your skin, being consistent with it, that ideology and the principle behind that, it's been practiced for so many years, but it's becoming so big now in America, where I just see Korean products everywhere. So many YouTube gurus and skincare review specialists just loving Korean products.
I think to add to that, I was reminded of K-pop and how people are obsessed with I mean, let's be real, K-pop is great. But yeah, it's a product that's been imported here, and there's an obsession and craze over it. It's just insane to me.
Do you know what really like is insane to me is like, because it's not like Korea didn't try to bring K-pop to America before.
Yeah.
But there's just been this crazy sensation with BTS and Blackpink specifically that it rocked my world. Like, to see Blackpink at Coachella, I'm like, what? I was like, that's so cool. I was so proud to be Korean, because I'm like, this is like the music that I kind of grew up with. Well, I did grow up with it, and I love it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's really nice, because I remember when, you know, during my teen years, remember Boa?
Yeah.
Boa tried to make it in America.
Yeah.
And I mean, how many other people were there? Rain, you know, he was in movies. Seven. There has to be more. Like CL even. CL tried to make it big in here, and I'm like, girl, I wish you would just pump out music now, because just take advantage. I mean, she is, but she's just not making music like she used to. But I just think it's interesting because she came out of the same company as Blackpink.
Yeah, that's so true. And I always had mixed feelings. Like, once the whole like Psy Gangnam Style video came out, and Asian people were put more on this media map, I was a little torn, because I'm glad that other people enjoy K-pop, because when I was growing up as a teenager, what was it? It was like Fly to the Sky and Dongbangshinggi and Big Bang, you know. I loved them, but they weren't seen as cool. And so I'm torn, because it's just like, you guys love Asia so much, but I don't feel that same love for Asian Americans, you know. And it just like, there is that similar theme that I see with Afang Moy, where it's just like, wow, look at the East, and like, we love how exotic it is. And then you look at the Asian Americans, and it's just like, oh, I guess you're here. You know, you can just keep living your lives. I don't know. That's kind of just how I felt.
Yeah, I feel like that too.
Yeah.
I feel like when I want to talk about my culture to people, they're like, okay, that's great. Anyways, let's carry on.
I think that it's interesting that the movie Minari, it was interesting how a lot of Americans were able to relate to the family story of it. And I truly believe, and I argue, that it is an American story. And it's interesting because when a lot of people in Korea watched it, even though the language was in their language for most of the time, in terms of themes, they couldn't really relate to it, because they don't know what it's like to necessarily be an immigrant, because they never left their home country. So I just thought that was so interesting, because we have so much to relate to with all the other American groups that are represented in our country. Yet we still are seen as other, and it feels like Far East Asian things are more appreciated than the homegrown people.
Yeah, I agree. But then if we go to the motherland country, they're going to be like, oh, you're an American.
Yeah. And that's the dilemma that a lot of us face is, where do we belong?
We don't feel like we have like a home base, a place to really call home, even though this is our given birthright. And that, honestly, to me, it sucks.
Yeah, it does. It's a lot to navigate through. And we'll definitely talk about that way more because I just think it's a fascinating topic.
Me too.
So when we think of themes, one that just can't go ignored is the model minority myth. And I know that this is a topic that is almost overspoken in the Asian community, but it is still really important. So for any listener who may be unfamiliar with the model minority myth, it's basically an idea that was brought about in 1966 by sociologist William Peterson. He wrote an article basically stating that Japanese Americans were able to overcome discrimination and achieve overall success because of their family structure and cultural values, particular in being hardworking. Now, it's called a myth because, yes, although there are some statistics that show that Asian Americans are excelling, like earning a greater household income than white families, these statistics don't put other factors into account, such as more people in these Asian households are working and contributing to the family income than white family households. It also doesn't put into account of ethnic groups within the Asian race category that live below the poverty line. So, for example, according to the 2000 U.S. Census, Cambodians had a per capita income of about $10,000, and over 90% of their population did not have a bachelor's degree. So when people talk about stereotypes, I often hear them saying of Asians, like, hey, at least Asian stereotypes are nice. You're all typed as smart, hardworking, overachievers. And it's just so interesting to me because these stereotypes have been around forever, and they actually really screwed over Asian immigrants. Like back when the Spaniards were making voyages to the Americas in the 1500s, they favored Filipino sailors because they were known as docile and hardworking. And I already shared about how horribly they were treated. And also in 1865, Chinese people were hired by the Central Pacific Railroad as track layers for the Transcontinental Railroad. The company president, Leland Stanford, praised the Chinese as quiet, peaceable, industrious, and economical. And he also credited them, saying without them, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national highway. So about 90% of his workforce, or about 12,000 Chinese men, were building this railroad. And the conditions were rough. And these rail workers, they did try going on strikes, but they could never succeed in having the company agree to their terms. One newspaper estimated that at least 1,200 Chinese immigrants died in the building of the railroad. And a final slap to the face occurred when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific railroads finally met in the middle to lay down the last spike to link the Transcontinental Railroad. And not a single Chinese worker could be found in official photographs commemorating the occasion. So an example that's especially relevant to today is that precluding to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the increase of Chinese immigrants was discussed as the Chinese problem. And I couldn't just help but think that when I was reading this, that it sounds so similar to how the coronavirus was coined as the Chinese virus. So this expectation to be better than the other minority groups not only severely misrepresented us and pitted us against all the other groups, it also silenced us. All we're good for is to be quiet and to do our jobs. And when we don't meet that expectation of being useful, we get blamed for it. And so again, I had no idea about this part of our history. Many history books that I've read in school just mentioned that Chinese people worked the railroads, but they didn't include all of these shameful details. And Sehlynn, I would love to hear your thoughts on how the model minority myth or Asian stereotypes have also affected you personally.
Yeah, when we talk about the model minority myth, I come to a time in a memory where when my dad would tell me, hey, if you want to excel in life and you want to be successful here in America, you're going to have to work harder in the sense you're going to have to get more education. You're going to have to be more than just bilingual, learn Spanish too. You have to do all these things so that you can stand out. And I didn't really think that way until I actually entered the workplace. And when I started working after college, professionally, I found myself being compared to my predecessor a lot. And it really bothered me because I didn't look like her. I wasn't her ethnicity, and I was constantly just being told that like she did so many great things and that I should be more like her. So I worked really hard for a year and a half and I did get promoted, but also during that time of the year, I also saw her get promoted. So not only was she promoted before I even entered the team, but she was promoted again. And feeling that pressure that I have to be like her was just so there. So when I did eventually get promoted, I was really excited and all these things, but everything changed after a series of events and I found out that she was making way more than me. And she was given a higher raise when she was promoted than me for a role that I got into that actually I thought was harder than her current role. So it's a sticky topic. It's hard to talk about because it really hits home.
Yeah. And I think that in no way are we trying to blame like white people and be like, oh, you guys are so privileged and whatever. But we're just trying to point out that this is the reality, is that we do have to work harder. And it's because I think a lot of times it's perpetuated by this myth or this stereotype that we're hardworking. And so we always have to fight more. And that's just how it is, you know, and we're not here to hate on this coworker, you know, that got the raise, not. Right? It's just, this is what happened. And, you know, there could have been other factors at play, but let's also just think, you know, race probably had a role in it.
Yeah, I honestly think so too, because, you know, I think a lot of people can relate to the fact when we are taught to keep our heads down and just not speak up. Yeah. I never once thought that I should be asking for more because I really do believe I deserve more. I just thought that even if I think this way, I'm not, you know, who am I to ask for it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that goes into the next theme that I do want to explore too, which is the theme that Asian Americans have faced for centuries is deception and broken dreams. Isn't that a fun topic to talk about?
Oh, yeah.
But it's true. A lot of Asian countries had their own political turmoil back in the day that left their citizens starving and dying. And around this time, Western countries were actually looking for laborers. So it was like the perfect storm for more Asians to immigrate to the U.S. And during the California Gold Rush, California was painted to the Chinese people as the Gold Mountain, and Hawaii was painted as a paradise to the Japanese. However, when these people arrived, it was nothing like what they were told. They lived in harsh conditions. They didn't receive the wages they were promised, and they had to work for long hours with little sleep. And a lot of families also had to be separated for the sake of chasing opportunities to provide financial support. So I just wanted to read 2 letters that I found in Erica Lee's book that I thought just was so sad. The first one is from an unknown husband, and it's undated, but it says, "My beloved wife. It has been several autumns now since your dull husband left you for a far remote alien land. Because I can get no gold, I am detained in this secluded corner of a strange land." The second letter is from a mother in China dated February 2nd, 1898. "My son, take notice. You have been away from home for years. During that time, your second elder brother died. Then your father died. And then your eldest brother died too. I am old and weak now, and I may die at any moment. You should save some money and should come back at least next year. Come back. Don't forget your mother, please. Your mother." So those are some letters. And then also around that time, there were also picture brides. So basically, Asian men in the U.S. wanted wives, so matchmaking services were set up where photos of the potential husband and wife were exchanged. However, the photos of the men were often staged, so the men would dress up in borrowed suits and stood in front of places of business to make themselves look rich. Or they even sent touched-up photos or photos of themselves when they were younger. So when these young women would see these photos and think that they're moving to America to live a better life and start a family with a successful man, they arrive and their dreams are immediately broken. Their husband could be well into his 60s and he could be poor, and he most likely needs his new wife to take care of him. So many women would end up fending for themselves because their significantly older husbands would die much earlier than them. And you know how rough life as a woman was back in the day, regardless of race. And I still think that you can see traces of this in the Asian American experience today. Like, sure, we don't have picture brides or gold mines, but how many of us have been deceived into thinking that hard work will pay off? Like exactly your story's hitting. And how often have I been told that if I just work hard in school, keep my head down, go to a good college, get a good education, I'd be set for life. But I'm not still treated as an equal in this country. And sure, I can't complain about my job situation right now, but I also can't say that the America that I live in right now is where I would want any of my future children to grow up in. Like so many times I've been treated as an inferior because I'm Asian or a woman or both. And even just a couple months ago, I was outside in the morning going for my morning run and I had my mask on. And there was this woman who was coming up towards me, and she's the one who had her mask off. And she just started to yell at me, basically saying that coronavirus was my fault. And it was just so demoralizing to me. It was just so rude. But then I started to think that it sucks that whatever I've experienced is not the worst thing to have happened to our people. Like, think of all the rises in hate crimes against Asians within just this past year and how so many of them are directed towards vulnerable people, like old people and women. And some of these have been very fatal attacks where lives were lost. And it's like when you do well, you're not appreciated because you're just performing at the level you were expected to, like we were talking before. But once someone who looks like you messes up, it suddenly gives people the right to abuse you. And then there's this psychological abuse that also happens where we're trained into thinking that we don't deserve to speak up against this because we don't have it as bad as all the other races. But with all that we've discussed, it's very clear that Asian Americans aren't just immigrants who came here a couple generations ago. Our history with the U.S. runs deep, deeper than when it first even became its own country. Like predating its formation, it was also conditioned to see Asians as other and dispensable labor. That's what Asians are coming into when they enter into this country, and it's simply because of the way that they look. So I didn't even cover a fraction of all the stories of the millions of Asians who helped form and establish America as a country. And it genuinely hurts me to know that there are so many people that had to sacrifice so much of their cultural identity and silence their voices just to get by. So I guess like if there's one takeaway that I'd like our listeners to leave with in this episode is it's not to hate on America. Because I think if anything, immigrants love America so much. But it's to learn more about these people's stories and to share them through your own life.
Yeah, Jess, I couldn't agree more with everything that you said. And to add on to what you said, I think for me, I think it's important to stay proud of being both Asian and being American. My parents worked really hard to come here and they didn't sacrifice so much for me to not be proud of being Korean.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's important to stay being proud of being American, whether people think that I'm from here or not, because it's my birth given a right. And my last takeaway, I think, from all of this is that I really hope that I can be someone that speaks up for things like this, because I don't think enough of us do. And I also want to celebrate being Asian with other people. I want us to empower one another and to come together and to continue to grow our community, and for us to continue to just celebrate us, because I don't think we do that enough.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I just cannot reiterate enough that I truly love our country. I love America because this is my home. And it's not perfect, but I was born and raised here, and I'm not leaving anytime soon. There's no chance where I would prefer to live in Korea than America, to be completely honest, because this is my home. So I bring up Asian American history not to hate on America or point out its flaws and be super critical, but I think that when you truly love someone or something, you love it warts and all. And what that means is that you do have to acknowledge the flaws and see that there are areas of growth that are necessary. And I want us to grow as a country. I want to grow with this country. And that means that we have to acknowledge what happened in the past because it either directly or indirectly affects our present and future. So like Sehlynn and I did today, learn your story and your history and also share them with others. One musical that I love so much is Hamilton, and one of my favorite songs is the last song on the album, which is titled Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. And I know Lin-Manuel Miranda is a genius, so maybe he did this on purpose, but that song, the original cast member who sang it is an Asian American, Philippa Sue. And the song is basically about Eliza Hamilton. She's putting herself back into the narrative because she did not want to have a part with Alexander Hamilton for quite some time. But she puts herself in and she starts telling Alexander Hamilton's story. And there have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Asian Americans who were engulfed in flames, deceived, abused, and literally suffocated. And history did not include them. Like, I never learned any of this stuff when I was growing up in school. Maybe it's different, but at least for me, I barely knew the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Japanese internment camps. Like, those were just breezed over. And what I was actually taught growing up was to just blend in the best that I can. So if you can relate to anything we discussed today, I hope that you will find the courage to put yourself back into the narrative and put the Asian Americans who came before us back into the narrative as well. Tell the stories of the mistreated sailors who made voyages to the Americas possible. Tell the story of Ah Feng Moi. Tell the story of the 12,000 Chinese men who laid down the tracks of the Transcontinental Railroad. Although we can't change the past, I hope that these individuals can rest in peace a little better, knowing that someone remembers their sacrifice and that I can continue to educate myself so that our voices are never lost again in the narrative. So that's just what I wanted to conclude with, is look to the past and see how it affects our present. And again, I want to thank Erica Lee so much for writing The Making of Asian America. It's been such a wonderful read, and I actually cried when I was reading some of the stories because they're so compelling. And I know that so many people must appreciate you for allowing their stories to be heard. And I'm totally talking like she listens to this, but whatever. Maybe she will. Who knows?
Maybe she will.
I'm a fan. I'm an Erica Lee I stan. Is that how you say it?
I think so.
I don't know.
It took me a while I was like today years old when I found out what stan means.
Okay. Well, I love Erica Lee. I'm a fan. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for joining us for another episode of the Gifted Present podcast. We hope you guys like what we talk about. Please engage with us, slip into our DMs. We love talking with you guys. If you're curious about the book we talked about, then you can check out our show notes. And just to let you know, a preview for next week's episode, we'll be talking about immigrant families. So till then, see ya, love ya, ciao.